So some of you may have already seen it, but earlier this week I released my first game. This process, from coming up with the main concept all the way to editing the final trailer, has taken me about a month and a half, and I thought it might be helpful to other aspiring game developers if I were to share some of my experience, specifically what I wish I knew before starting the project. This will be an overview of every step of the process, ranging from coming up with design ideas to making the art and all of the roadblocks I ran into along the way. Before we start, the game is free to play now, so I'll be linking where you can try it for yourself in the description. So for context, everything I learned about game design, coding, and animation only really started about 4 months ago. I think a pretty common problem that beginner game devs run into is starting a brand new project and never seeing it through to the end. Admittedly, as a game dev, we have pretty big egos and we end up getting a little ambitious right off the bat. Eventually, I came to a point where I felt like I was getting nowhere, and honestly, this is probably where a lot of new devs start to give up. If I was going to make this dream possible, I needed to rethink my process completely and set much more reasonable goals for myself. While it's tempting to work on that dream project you have in your head that's been slowly eating away at you, the fastest way to grow is by taking baby steps first. So my new goal was to finish a game. That way I could see what the full process is like from beginning to end without getting overwhelmed and moving on to something else. Thus, FLIPNAUT was born. The first day of development was really just coming up with an idea for the game, and this was actually harder than I expected. My first huge tip for you guys is to find a way to organize your thoughts and ideas. Now, I'm not sponsored, but I definitely recommend you check out a website like Milanote where you can keep all of your details and brainstorms in one place. I also knew I wanted to work on this game with my friend Sean, who is a really great video game music composer, so having a place where you can communicate and share ideas with your team is very important. A mechanic I thought I had a pretty decent shot at accomplishing was gravity manipulation. It was simple enough to figure out how to implement as a beginner, and also interesting enough to create some unique puzzles. Now, when it comes to prototyping your game, it's very important that you have a detailed idea of all of the mechanics. If I were to redo this project over again from the beginning, I would have definitely spent more time on this phase. A ton of time can be saved by having these systems in place from the very beginning, and if I had spent a couple more days on the prototype, I honestly believe I could have cut development time in half. But instead, I really just went with ideas as I came up with them, which doesn't make for a very cohesive or well-paced game. But you live and you learn. I'll say this right now, creating art and animations is by far my favorite part of the process. Nothing brings a game to life quite like giving the world character. One of my biggest goals though was to lay off of the art until much later in the process. That way I could have a strong foundation before I started to clutter the project with complex animation systems. Now, I did crack a few times and drew a few assets here and there, but for the most part, I controlled that urge and just started making levels for the game. Designing good puzzles is not an easy task, especially for a solo dev. It's really hard to figure out if a puzzle design is too easy or too difficult because you designed it and you know the solution before it's even finished. Here are a few tips I learned designing my first puzzles, which could help you with your own games. Finding a solution starts with identifying a problem. If you want a puzzle to have some level of challenge, then you really have to stump yourself first. Start by making something impossible to solve, and then find a way that it could be solved. Good puzzles give you all of the information right off the bat. Ocarina of Time is a classic, and easily one of my favorite games. One of its biggest issues, though, is that some puzzles are only solvable if you do something unnatural, like point the camera at the ceiling to find a trigger. The only way to figure this out is if you get lucky and see it out of the corner of your eye. And obviously, this was one of the first 3D games ever, so they were still figuring this stuff out. But what made 2D Zelda games so good was that it's impossible to miss all of the details in a room, making it much easier for a player to understand what they have to do to progress. All this to say that I kind of failed this step in some areas. Sometimes the solution is barely out of frame, but at least this tip could help you guys with your own games. Pacing your levels. I think this tip is probably the hardest to pull off because, again, you can't really tell the difficulty of a puzzle when you're the one who created it. This is really where having playtesters come in is so important because you want to make sure that each progressing puzzle is slightly more difficult than the last. I had a really great bit of feedback on a Reddit post for the game saying that some puzzles are way too easy compared to others, and if I had done some more playtesting beforehand, this could have been a really easy fix for rearranging their placements. I think it's also really important to ease the player into the puzzles. That way you aren't throwing too much new information at them all at once, but instead giving them something slightly new to figure out every time. Finally, after about a month of designing systems, creating puzzles, and deciding on a satisfying ending for the game, it was time to dive right into the art and animation. I don't have a ton of footage from this time because it was many hours of drawing and revising, but I'll at least tell you what I learned. I think the biggest success I had art-wise was making the player and important landmarks very readable. Most of the backgrounds are pretty dark, so making the player a very bright shade of green helps so that you don't lose track of him. There's also a thin line of this same shade of green across all of the platforms and floors that you walk on, which hopefully makes finding your footing much easier too. This is my first time working with a very limited color palette. Aside from my logo on the menu screen, there are only 6 colors used throughout the whole game, and because there's such a small amount of them, I needed to give each color a main purpose. 3 of the darker colors were used specifically for the background, and the 3 brighter colors were for hazards and the player and collectibles. Because the player was made on a 32 by 32 pixel canvas, I decided to use a tile palette that was 16 by 16 for all of the level design of the game. Creating tiles that work for different scenarios is pretty key towards making each zone feel unique. It's also a bit time consuming at first, but in the long run, it's incredibly worth it to just use these tiles as building blocks. As far as animation goes, in the interest of time, I tried to keep them really simple. The jump animation is 1 frame, and I was definitely inspired by the original Mario game with this one. But for a falling animation, I made it 2 frames, that way you could see his little antenna wiggling around. I did the same with the walk animation, which is only 4 frames, and I also toyed around with the idea of using a gravity switching animation, but scrapped it because I felt like it was a bit too distracting. If you're new to animation, following a process like this, where you're keeping things as simple as possible, will ultimately give you a better result, especially when you realize how complicated animation can be in code. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the music and sound design, because Sean did a really awesome job, and I want to share some tips when it comes to working as a team. It's so important that you're extremely clear in your instructions for your partner. When I started this project, I basically just gave him a very rough outline of what I wanted for the music and sounds, giving him buzzwords like spacey vibes or death sound. If you have an idea in your head for how something should sound, you have to be a lot more specific. Once I started giving more details for each specific song and sound, the results were 100 times better, and the only thing we were missing was communication. Huge props to him. I think the music is the best part of this game for sure. And jumping to today, FLIPNAUT is finally out. I have to tell you, actually completing something is so rewarding, and it's so important for us new game devs to experience what it's like to finish something you started. Is it a lot of work? Yeah, but if you have this dream that you feel like you don't have enough time for or are waiting for the right opportunity, nobody's gonna tell you to start it, man, just start it. I've been working a full-time job during this process, and yes, it's been hard to juggle at times, but if you want something enough, you'll make it happen. So if you're on the edge about jumping into a new passion or want to learn a new skill, just do it, man. You only live once, and I think you're wasting time if you aren't doing what you love. Sorry if that became a bit of a ramble, but I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please check out FLIPNAUT and let me know what you think. It's free to play for PC and Mac on itch.io. The link is in the description, and definitely give me some feedback. I'd love to hear it. I've got more game dev related stuff coming soon, so stay tuned for that. Peace, guys.